Craig is going to talk to us about native plants, especially for butterflies and monarchs. And obviously there's a lot of monarchs coming through right now. He is the Texas Nature Tracker Biologist with Texas Parks and Wildlife. We're all very fond of Texas Parks and Wildlife. He also has on one of his pages, I thought, a really nice quote. He's reminded that each time he sees a child's joy when a butterfly or dragonfly come on their finger. And I think a lot of us can relate to that, seeing children have that kind of joy. He also worked at the Guadalupe River State Park and many other wildlife positions. So Craig, take it away.
Thank you very much. Nice to be here tonight. First of all, thank you for the opportunity to visit with you tonight. I know last month you had a great presentation that went into a lot of detail about monarch migration and all kinds of things, monarch and milkweed related. What I'm going to try to do tonight is talk to you a little bit more about plants that monarchs in our state can take advantage of, both the milkweeds, but then also the very important plants that help provide food for the adults. When we think about monarchs, a lot of times we get kind of locked into thinking about milkweeds and only milkweeds. But certainly there's a lot more to it than that, as I'm sure you all are well aware of. I'm going to focus a lot. So Texas is obviously a huge state. And so this program being down, you folks mostly being down in the Houston area, I try to tailor it a little bit for the Houston area. So some of you that are in the Bastrop area, and I saw somebody from the Hill Country and other places around, don't hesitate to ask questions about those areas, but hopefully there'll be a little mix for everybody here. A lot of these plants have a pretty wide distribution. To get started, let me just tell you briefly, our program, which is Texas Nature Trackers, is part of the Wildlife Diversity Program of TPWD. And specifically, we are part of the Community Stewardship and Engagement Team, which is now going to become its own program. I don't know what that means other than you spell the word differently. But what we try to do is we try to engage the larger community of Texans to get outside and help us track the plants and animals of the state of Texas. And we use iNaturalist. Most of you hopefully have heard of that app to do just that. We do have a web page where you can go and visit right there. And you can find out about the projects that we take or that we're monitoring, the target species that we're looking for, and then other ways to get involved with the Texas Nature Trackers program. These are our 12 projects that we have. They range from documenting the herps, reptiles, and amphibians of Texas, all the way to bald eagle nests, to bees and wasps of Texas, to even the milkweeds of Texas as well. So quite a range of projects that we're involved with in one form or another. We're also doing some individual or some smaller research, very focused research projects. And in fact, we are in the process of kind of revisiting what the Texas Nature Trackers program is. We've done a lot of large scale data collection over the years using iNaturalist, but here in the last couple of years, we've started a couple of smaller projects, more focused. We use community scientists to help gather that data. One is on loggerhead shrike nest monitoring up in Old Settlers Park in Round Rock. And then here in Bernie, where my office is, we're doing some work on grassland sparrows that overwinter in Texas. Our focus are 2 SGCN species, and I'll tell you what that is in a moment. The grasshopper sparrow on the top and the LeConte sparrow there in the middle of the lower picture. We also have a presence on social media. We have our Instagram page at Texas Nature Trackers. We also have a Facebook page. We do periodic live events. We try to post a lot. We're going to be posting quite a bit in the next 3 weeks for the Texas Pollinator Pile Blitz. So you can join either one of those pages and follow along with things that we put up there and the fun that we have with that as well. So more specifically, what we do is we reach out to all of you, everybody in the state of Texas can be a community scientist. It's not limited to master naturalist or NIPSOT folks. It's anybody in the state can be community scientists. Using the app iNaturalist, which is really fun to use. It's a great way to learn about the plants and animals of Texas, for whether it's just for yourself or to actually help us collect data. And we get that data into projects, as I just showed you. And then some of that data focused primarily on the SGCNs, species of greatest conservation need. Eventually, some of that that's important data for those species can get to the research and conservation community. Again, here's another summary. Here's the SGCNs. The goal is to get that data into what's called the Texas Natural Diversity Database. And that's just a holding place where those kind of records can be housed. So we have public access to know where our rare populations of plants and animals and plant communities are throughout the state of Texas. So what's an SGCN? I've said it 3 or 4 times already, but a species of greatest conservation need is a native plant or animal that is declining or rare and in need of some kind of intervention to try to prevent it from being listed under state or federal regulation. So our goal is to identify those plants and animals that are in decline, and figure out why are they in decline, what are the reasons for that, and see if eventually that we can get to take conservation related steps to try to reverse that decline. The goal is actually to get all of those more than 1,200 species, almost 1,300 species, off the SGCN list. It'd make our jobs a lot easier, I got to tell you that right now. So who are those SGCNs? It's everything from the whooping crane that visits the Gulf Coast every winter, to our Texas horned lizard, to the Houston toad up in the Bastrop area, to the American bumblebee. We've got clams, we've got the bob white, there's the loggerhead shrike. This is just a tip of the iceberg kind of overview. Even a species of blazing star that is rare in the state of Texas. So let's talk real quickly before we launch into everything about the current status of the monarch. Recently, you may have heard that the monarch was declared an endangered species, and it was declared an endangered species by the IUCN, which is the International Union for Conservation of Nature's Red List of Threatened Species. That's a big, long term, obviously. That is not the designation by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which is the one that actually lists very specifically through that agency. The reason IUCN did it is because the Western population has declined somewhere between 90 and 99%, depending on the year. The Eastern population, the Western population being California, the Eastern population being everything east of the Rockies, has declined between 22 and 72% over the past decade. And the reason that number is so large, that percent variation is so large, is some years they have a horrible year and the population plummets, and then some years they have a remarkable recovery, to some degree of recovery anyway, and that's why you get that wide fluctuation year to year. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service did receive a petition for listing the monarch a few years ago. They reviewed it, went through all of the process. It usually takes a year or two to do that. They passed on having it declared as a threatened or endangered species, but they review it, I believe, every 2 years. It'll be interesting to see if the IUCN designation puts any more pressure on the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to take a look at that. And of course, you're trying to do that based on science, not on thoughts and emotion. They're trying to use the best science that they can. Texas recently reviewed the species. All of our species that are considered for being an SGCN or threatened or endangered at the state level go through a review process where we use the best science. It ended up with a ranking of between S3 and S4, which just kind of means that for Texas, the population is pretty stable. And there will be people that vehemently disagree with that. But the bottom line is, for us in Texas, most of our monarchs are coming here in the spring, laying their eggs, and then continuing to move on. And by by June or so, monarchs in many parts of the state are gone for the rest of the summer. Then they come through for a few weeks in the fall. So it's really hard to say, is it threatened or endangered in the state of Texas, because it has such a wide distribution from Canada all the way to us. So that makes it a little bit trickier. In terms of SGCN, when we talk about milkweeds, there is only one species of milkweed that is listed as an SGCN. It's found in only 2 counties in Texas, in Starr and Zapata counties, right down along the Rio Grande. Very small populations. These are close-ups of the plants by a naturalist user, Joshua Eckert. I hope I'm not butchering his name. It's being proposed for listing under the Federal Endangered Species Act. It was originally petitioned in 2007. In the state of Texas, we listed as S1, which means critically endangered. That probably will be designated sometime over the next few months. It usually takes a long time. The one thing, it's been going for a long time. 2007 is when it got actually petitioned. It's taken this long to get to this point. So that's a milkweed that is really hard to find, very susceptible to root plowing, if you will. And however, grazing, it doesn't seem to be bothered by grazing simply because it's got those toxins in there and livestock leave it alone, apparently. Well, with that in mind, let's go ahead and introduce milkweeds to you a little bit. We're not going to cover it in super detail, but hopefully add a few things to what you might have heard last month. So first of all, there are 2,000 to 3,000 species in the family Apocynaceae. Milkweeds used to be by themselves in the family Asclepiadaceae, but they were have been lumped in the last few years back into the Apocynaceae. So they're now part of another family. Lots of them. The reason there's between 2,000 and 3,000 species is there's still lots of back and forth about which ones are species, which are subspecies, that sort of thing. In the United States, there are approximately 135 species in North America, I should say, and I've seen numbers as high as 160 species. The family, or former family, Asclepias, or the genus name for many of the milkweeds, Asclepias, was named after the Greek god of healing, Asclepios. And he's actually in the night sky. He's called Ophiuchus, huge dispersed constellation. I've looked for it. It's really hard to find, to be honest with you, because it's so enormous in the sky, but it's out there. And of course, milkweed gets its name because of the milky sap. And the members, the hemp and the climbing, what is it? Oh my gosh, now I'm going to forget. I'll come back to it. I'll try to remember it. Somebody put in the chat if you remember what Apocynaceae. I can see the plant. I just can't come up with it. I want to call it Indian hemp. Maybe that's one of the species. They also have milky sap, but I should say not all milkweeds have milky sap. They all have sap, but there are a few, including butterfly milkweed, which many of you might be familiar with, that don't have milky sap. So they are referred to as the immortal plants. They've had lots of use over human history for all kinds of ailments. They contain cardinalide alkaloids, which are toxic. That's why most animals won't eat milkweeds because they taste terrible, and they can actually, if you ingest enough, it can kill you. The point here is if livestock are eating enough milkweeds that it kills them, then their pastures are really, really overgrazed, poorly managed. So that shouldn't happen in a normal setting. Monarch caterpillars actually ingest some of the chemicals called cardiac glycosides, which are heart-stopping chemicals. They sequester those chemicals in their wings and in the exoskeleton of, the exoskeleton of the caterpillar and the wings and the exoskeleton of the adult. So when an animal bites into it, it gets that terrible taste. And generally one bite of the apple in this case, they will never eat that again. Native Americans, other people use milkweeds for a lot of different things, including ailments and even food. So it's amazing. They use the stuff for chewing gum and they fried up fritters, but they also treated everything from snake bite to asthma to warts to everything else on that list. So it's no wonder it's called the immortal plant. The pods and the silk have had a history of being used in a lot of different ways. You can see some of them listed there. The larger pods were used as utensils. Children played with them as doll craters or ferry boats. Fibers during World War II, and I've actually run into a couple of people that did this as children. They actually went out during World War II and collected the milkweed fluff to be able to stuff into life jackets for the Navy and for the Army that was fighting in World War II when kapok, the material from kapok trees, was not available. So milkweeds are constantly at war with their surroundings because out in nature, everything's trying to eat everything else. And again, they produce those bad chemicals that are toxic. They also have that sticky sap. The sap is actually very useful if a tiny little monarch caterpillar takes its first bite of a leaf in the wrong place, in the vein, for example, of a milkweed plant. It can literally drown in that sap and it gets sticky very fast, and it can glue their head to get their mouth parts together. And a lot of, especially first instar, brand new monarch caterpillars actually die from that. That's one of the ways that their population is limited. So it's chemical warfare at its best when it comes to milkweed plants. And of course, they did some famous experiments years ago where they offered naive blue jays a monarch and they took a bite and then they literally threw up. So that was done by Lincoln Brower, who is one of the fathers of our understanding of the milkweeds and the migration of the monarch butterfly. Milkweeds are so unique in the plant family. Probably orchids are the only other one that have such a unique arrangement of flowers. I'm going to show you that here in detail in just a minute. When I was at the Museum of Natural History in Chicago several years ago, they actually had their own display case just on milkweeds. Pretty amazing. I was really stunned by that. And it just kind of gave me a new appreciation for how unique our milkweeds really are. So when we think about the flowers, and when I talk about the uniqueness, we've talked about the chemicals and all that, but the flowers themselves are also incredibly unique. When we think about the normal flower, we've got the 4 parts of a typical flower. We've got the sepals. That's the part that protects the unopened flower. They're usually green, not always, but usually. Then you have the petals. Those are the showy parts that attract the insects. And then you have the male and the female components, the pistil of the female and the stamen for the male. And that's a typical flower. And then you go and you take a look at an aster or a member of the composite family, and they can have 2 different kinds of flowers. They can have disc florets in the center of the flower in this head right here. They have all kinds of little tubular flowers that look like this, or they can have around the outside. Not all of them do, but a lot of them do. They can have what are known as ray florets or ray flowers. Each one of these is an individual flower. Typically, the disc flowers are the fertile flowers. The ray flowers can either be female or typically sterile, but they're there to kind of attract and say, hey, here we are, come on over here. Provide lots of food choice for pollinators. And then, of course, you have other flowers like the members of the bean family that have the keel and the banner and the wings and very irregular flower. And then it comes to the milkweed flower. And the first time I learned about this when I was getting ready to do a presentation years ago on milkweeds, this blew me away. You look at a milkweed flower, if you really look at a milkweed flower, it's a little hard to figure out what the heck you're looking at. It's not so hard. You can find the sepals, you can find the petals. The sepals are underneath, of course. They're usually small most of the time. They're greenish and much smaller than you see here of the petals. The petals themselves are 5. There are 5 of them, and they can be either reflex, turned backwards, or they can be up and arching. And we'll show you examples of that. This is where it gets really weird to me. So you've got this thing called a hood, and you've got this other thing called a horn right here. And this varies between species. But if you add the hood and the horn, that gives you plus the anther, which is right in here. It's not even connected. I mean, golly, this is so weird. So the anther is right in here. All those parts are referred to as the stamens. Then if you look at the stigma, here's the stigma, the sticky part, but it's not sticky like most flowers, the tip of most flowers. It actually has these slits right here, the ovaries down here, that's all of the pistil right there in the center. But this slit right here, and there are 5 of these, and it's really, really, really amazing to see what actually happens to get this thing pollinated. So first of all, let's look at examples. So if we look at these 3 flowers, the green petals on this particular species right here, notice they're arching up like you'd expect on a petal. And then here you have the petals that are actually pointing backwards on the butterfly milkweed. So they're reflexed. And then over here, if we look at this part, so here is the hood, the horn right here. And then here is the gland on the translator arm. That little black thing right here. I've got my pointer over it if I move it. And so the pollen is on either side of this slit. And it's a little hard to see that slit, but it's right there. And we're going to show you a different close-up here. Let's see here if I can get this to move now. So that little gland that I mentioned, that little dark little dot that was on that flower, that is the gland right there. It's sticky, okay? And then you have these 2 things called translator arms, and attached to those are these bags or sacs of pollen called pollinia. Well, what happens is that this is where the pollen is. It's not just floating through the air or in its own little individual pieces that are picked up by bees and other things. It's actually picked up as a package. An example of that, here's a honeybee nectaring on a milkweed. And you can see these little kind of butterfly wing-like things that are kind of gold here. There's several of them here. If we do a little bit of a close-up, there's what they look like. So you can see they're kind of like this. And what happens is these pollinia are sitting like this on the edge of the pistil of the milkweed, okay? And what happens is that little sticky thing gets onto one of the bee's feet, and they actually can be a real problem for bees, small bees. because they can get so many of them stuck on them. But they hit that with their foot and they pull this pollinia out of the flower. And what happens is over the next 45 minutes or so, the rotator arms that I showed you, the translator arms, fold so that the pollinia snap shut like this. So you got two of them now together. And then what happens is the bee goes along its business, goes to the next flower. Somehow that pollinia stuck to that bee's foot has to slide into that slit on the milkweed's pistil. And I got to tell you how this happens, I have no idea. So right here is one of the slits that hasn't been pollinated. Here's one where pollinia are kind of stuck in the slit there. And here's another one where it looks like a pollinia got into the slit here. So again, it's amazing that this happens. Think about this. The bees aren't doing this on purpose. They're not like going, okay, there's a slit, let me slide it in. Nope, they are not. It's random. It seems very random. And so that's why when you see a milkweed flower head with maybe 20 or 30 or 40 flowers on it, a lot of times you only see one pod, if you ever see any pods on that flower head, right? Dries up, goes away. You never knew there were flowers there. But if you see a pod, that is from one pair of pollinia sacs that got stuck into the slit of one of these flowers, produced all those seeds inside that one pod. So again, to see a milkweed plant with 2 or 3 pods, that's pretty impressive. But obviously it's very successful because there are a lot of milkweeds and they're scattered all over the place. I just find that pretty fascinating. So let's now talk about just milkweeds in general. There's 64 species, give or take, in Texas. Some have very limited ranges. There are a few only found in Big Bend, a few only found in the Panhandle. There are about 9 species, somewhere in 9 species found in Harris County. And then you could add a little bit more if you go to outside Harris County. In the hill country where I live, there are 21 species. And then flower periods, most of the time, a lot of them bloom in the spring with the first flush of rain and cool weather. And then occasionally, if we get rains in August, July, August, September, you'll see a reflush of certain species and see them again. And they do respond, by the way. A lot of them respond to mowing and fire. They'll actually regenerate sometimes if they have the proper moisture. So let's just look at a few of them, just a very few very quickly. This particular species, antelope horns, it is in your county, is in Harris County. You can see it probably has one of the widest distributions across the state of Texas. It usually is a low growing perennial, long lived, lives several years from an individual plant. And each year they seem to get more stems or ramets on them. And at the end of a lot of those stems, of course, will be the flower head. We find them all over the place along roadsides, in waste areas, in burned over areas, in pastures, quite common species of milkweed in the state of Texas. And as a result, a whole lot of monarchs are raised on the leaves and flowers of this particular species. Then we have green milkweed. This is going to be more common in your area. It needs a little bit more moisture. Notice the distribution is a little bit more to the eastern half of the state, whereas antelope horns is more to the west, although the ranges do overlap. And they look very similar, actually. Green flowers, they've got the pink hoods and horns, pinkish purple, if you will. They've got the long kind of narrow leaves. But if we compare the two of them, the antelope horn has narrow, generally folded leaves, whereas the leaves of viridis or green milkweed look, I always describe it as egg-shaped. So a little bit more round at the base. The plant is a little bit more upright. When you look at the individual flowers, if somebody was just to bring the flowers to you, you would see that the petals of antelope horn are a little bit flatter. They're more like this, whereas viridis or green milkweed is more upright like that. So antelope horn and then green milkweed. And you can kind of see that. Here's green milkweed on the left. Here's antelope horn on the right. The rest of it looks pretty darn similar when it comes to the flowers. Then we have another very widely distributed plant that does exist in your area, grows in a lot of weedy spots, roadside ditches, places like that. This is zyzotes or longhorn milkweed. Most people are going to call it zyzotes. I call it longhorn because I can remember it and I can say longhorn better than I can say zyzotes. But they have very long horns on individual flowers. That's why they get that other common name. They are, again, found all over the place. They have very few flowers. Unlike the other ones that we showed you, have a big head at the end of the stem. These are small clusters of flowers at the base of leaves up and down the stem, as this photo demonstrates for you. And by the way, monarchs use all of these that I am showing you. And then we have another one that you can find in your area and has a pretty wide distribution, although not quite as common. And it may be just because a lot of it's overlooked. It's much more common the farther north you go, out into Oklahoma and Kansas and Missouri and those parts of the country. But it's called wand milkweed, viridiflora, or zigzag milkweed. The reason it gets its name is the stem oftentimes zigs back and forth. So here it comes up this way, zigs back, zigs back, zigs, so it's a ziggy zaggy sort of stem. The flower clusters come in clusters at the base of leaves up and down that zigzagging stem. The petals are completely reflexed. So this may not look like it's in flower, but it's completely in flower. And also the leaves are kind of interesting. They always look to me like they're upside down. They look like they should be flipped the other way. But this is the typical growth form that you see. It gets about 3 feet tall. And again, you can find this. And this one also is used by monarchs. And then one of the most beautiful ones, oh my gosh, I know you all think this too. This is butterfly weed. I hate the word weed when it comes to something so bloody beautiful. But anyway, so we've got this beautiful low growing milkweed. It lives for long periods of time. They get bigger each year. They grow in pretty dry conditions. And they're very, very gorgeous plants of gardens and of course of fields and prairies. The flowers are born at the end. And notice that the flowers are completely orange. The orange can vary a little bit, but they're very brightly orange, not much yellow that you see in there. You can see that its distribution is mostly East Texas, somewhat up into the Panhandle. We've got a few counties. Kirk County's has found it over there and even a little bit farther west, but generally it's a plant of the tall grass prairie, or where the tall grass prairie used to be. Now, this is the plant that a lot of people confuse with tropical milkweed. You'll notice with tropical milkweed, the difference here. Notice how everything here is orange. Here we've got this reddish orange, and then we've got this pale orange. So there's a color contrast between the hoods and horns and the actual petals. Plus, tropical milkweed grows much taller, as many of you know. It's very easily found in garden centers. Unfortunately, tropical milkweed is often confused with butterfly milkweed, and some dealers will actually call this butterfly weed or butterfly milkweed to try to entice you to buy it. And I know a lot of it grows in the Houston area. I know the San Antonio Botanical Garden grows tons of it. It's actually a plant that is easily grown. People like it because it's very beautiful. It blooms multiple times. Unfortunately, here in this part of Texas, it will grow year round. And the problems and I know that was talked about last month, so I don't want to spend too much time on it, but I'm going to strongly recommend that if you have butterfly milkweed growing right now, go out there, and if there's no eggs or caterpillars on it, cut it to the ground and let the migrating monarchs pass by, because you're creating problems for them in terms of their migration, in terms of disease, the OE that I'm sure that was talked about last month. Just cut it to the ground and be done with it for the fall and let the monarchs do their thing. I can't emphasize that more. One of the reasons, one of the theories about why monarchs migrate, besides the fact that when it gets below 32 degrees, they die, is that it allows them to escape those old milkweed plants up north that have diseases and parasites and all kinds of things that build up on those plants over the course of a summer. It allows them to escape that. Those plants die all the way back to the ground. And then when they come up in the spring, they're clean and fresh and ready to go. The OE will build up, can build up over time, but they're taking advantage of the fact that you've got brand new plants like here in the spring. So again, cut them down. I know some people out there are grimacing right now, and some of you will protest it, but if you really care about monarchs, cut it down. I really believe that.
Craig, you said butterfly weed, but you meant tropical, right?
Tropical, yes, cut down to tropical, yes, oh my gosh. Cut down to tropical. The butterfly weed will go away on its own. You don't have to do anything with that. And I should say that there are some milkweeds, native milkweeds, that come back in the fall. So you could argue, well, those milkweeds come back in the fall and the monarchs might use them. Yes, but they come back from the ground level. All of the old leaves and all the old stems fell away, started decomposing, and they're all brand new growth. So the concentration of OE and the other potential problems is not as prevalent in those brand new plants. So hopefully that helps that as well, because that's a valid argument. And you all are familiar in your neck of the woods with shore milkweed. Beautiful plant, white flowers are kind of pinkish before they open. I love this plant. I wish I could grow it here, but I don't live where it grows. But I've seen it along I-10 as I travel to Houston. And of course, it's all along the Gulf Coast. Very popular for raising monarchs on in your neck of the woods, probably one of the most valuable plants down there. I don't know if she's still doing it, but there was a fisheries biologist, I believe biologist, that was actually she started raising this milkweed to distribute out of a fisheries shed a few years ago and passed around a lot of these plants. So again, I don't know. And unfortunately, I've forgotten her name and I apologize for that. Beautiful, beautiful milkweed that you should certainly encourage in your native plantings. Another one that looks a little bit like it, but it's a little spindlier plant, thinner leaves. This is called world milkweed. You wouldn't think this plant would actually, frankly, raise that many monarchs, but it does. Monarchs will eat it. A lot of times the milkweeds that have very narrow leaves tend to be a little bit more toxic, have a little bit more chemical in them. And there's a lot of variation in that chemical between the wide leafed ones and the narrow leafed ones. But world milkweed, you can always tell because there's at least 3, if not 4, most of the time it's 4 leaves at each node, at each point on the stem. And it has these little white flower clusters. I think it's a neat little plant. Always liked world milkweed. Wanted to show you just a couple from around the state, especially if those of you are attending from other parts of the state. I've probably said this already, but this is one of my favorite milkweeds. It turns out I have a lot of them. But this is growing out in the Panhandle. It's in West Texas. Big, robust plant. I grew up in Iowa, lived in Minnesota and Iowa and Missouri and Kansas and Nebraska, and we had the common milkweed. This reminds me of home because it has big, wide leaves like common milkweed. It grows very tall, has lots of dense flower clusters, but a really neat little plant. And I love it because right here, see that right there? Do you see the big nose and you see the 2 ears here and here and the 2 little eye spots? Kind of looks like a goofy looking dog, doesn't it? Anyway, there you go. That's one of the reasons I love this plant. But anyway, it blooms from May to September out in other parts of the state. These outlying places, I'm not sure that they're actually found here if they weren't planted. Then we have swamp milkweed, another one of my favorites. This one, I'm surprised that it doesn't grow in more places along the coast. Maybe it does. And these maps, it just hadn't been reported enough. These maps are only as good as the people reporting where they find the flowers, by the way. But in the hill country, you'll find populations along the Guadalupe River and elsewhere. But a big, tall, robust plant can get 5 to 6, 7 feet tall, grows along rivers and streams and marshy areas. Beautiful pink flowers. Monarchs love it. And I know I'm putting human characteristics on their behavior, but they nectar on it all the time and they raise a lot of caterpillars, especially the farther north you go, where it's much more common. And then another one, this is a showstopper. It's only found in the Panhandle in a few places. It needs moisture, so it likes to have its roots a little bit damp, but it has these magnificently large flowers. And the first time I ever saw this plant, and this is where I photographed it too. These are from Kansas, by the way. These photographs. I was driving down a marsh bird watching, and all of a sudden my windows were down. It was a beautiful day, and it was nice and flat out there. And all of a sudden I drive by through this smell that just about I passed out almost from the fragrance of the smell wafting through my open car windows. I slammed on the brakes. I got out and started looking around and go, what was that smell? And I found it in this showy milkweed. Unbelievably fragrant flowers, huge clusters of flowers with big leaves. And by the way, almost any milkweed I've ever smelled, incredibly fragrant. Next time you see some milkweed flowers, get your nose right in there, make sure there's no bees or other pollinators in there, but get in there and take a sniff. I'm telling you, unbelievably good smelling plant. Red ring, and I want to thank Don Stover for providing these photographs. Red ring looks a lot like the next one I'm going to show you, the endemic. It's up in East Texas in the piney woods for the most part. It has a little reddish ring around the base of each flower. So really pretty little milkweed. Here is our endemic Texas milkweed or rattlesnake milkweed. Again, found only in the Edwards Plateau and then also in the Big Bend region. This is actually one that you're going to find mostly in the shade. It's kind of a shade loving plant. So if you're in Texas Hill Country, this is a great one for shady areas. I've got a few plants in my yard which are dominated by pecan trees, and they do really, really well. So those are the milkweeds I want to share with you. Who's using milkweeds? We think about milkweed and we go monarch butterfly. Well, of course, the queen that is all over the state of Texas also uses milkweed. They have to have milkweeds lay their eggs on. And then also, if you go to the valley, then you have the soldier. It also lays its eggs on milkweeds exclusively. But milkweeds are also a host for all kinds of other insects. I mean, it's literally its own ecosystem. So for example, we've got our monarch caterpillar on the right. We've got upper left, the queen with the 3 sets of tubercles there. And then we've got this great looking moth called the milkweed tussock moth. The moth itself doesn't look like much, but check out that caterpillar. That is one fuzzy caterpillar, and they lay lots of eggs. They will decimate a plant as they grow. They all feed in mass, but they're really fuzzy. And what's really neat is they have the same color scheme as these other guys. Here's a moth and 2 butterflies, and yet they're still using those bright colors to tell would-be predators, I taste bad, leave me alone. And then, of course, we have beetles, all kinds of beetles. In fact, I just saw a milkweed. It was actually a swamp milkweed leaf beetle yesterday or the other day when I was out chasing monarchs. But they have beetles of this kind. We have the milkweed longhorn beetle. There's multiple species of it. This one tends to eat just the tips of the milkweed leaves. And so they're out there feeding, really beautiful. And again, bright colors to warn predators that I taste bad. And of course, there are aphids, lots of aphids. I know some of you probably get all these aphids and worry about that. They certainly suck a lot of sap, but of course, if you have ladybugs around, the ladybugs are feeding on them. The ants are guarding some of the aphids, but the best thing to do is what I do. You can either take some soapy water, spray it on if you want to eliminate some of the aphids, or you just take your finger and run it all up and down the stem. And of course, your finger turns orange, or orangey yellow, but you get rid of them that way. And then there are milkweed bugs. There are at least 2 different species. We have the large milkweed bug. Notice that black hatch across the middle of the body. And we have the small milkweed bug, which actually has an orange cross in the middle of the body. So this cross is actually interrupted by that black bar here. And then this is what they look like when they're immature. They don't go through a complete metamorphosis of egg, larva, pupa, adult. They actually go from egg to larva, and then they molt multiple times, eventually grow wings, and they become these adults that you see here. They can really wreak havoc on milkweed pods. So sometimes you might, if you're trying to get some milkweed seeds out of these pods and you see a bunch of these guys, you might want to move them or eliminate them. So you can actually have some seeds, they'll suck everything dry. And then of course you have the hymenoptera, the different bees, bumblebees, carpenter bees. You have honeybees, of course, and of course, wasps, lots of wasps. Here's a tarantula hawk wasp. They feed on the nectar. All wasps actually drink nectar as a food source, and then they prey on other insects as their source of food for their larvae. They're actually incredibly beneficial insects. And of course, lots of butterflies, including hair streaks. Hair streaks seem to really love milkweeds. They'll be there for long periods of time. We've got the gray on the left and the oak hair streak on the right as 2 examples. And of course, if you have prey, you have predators hiding in the milkweed flowers. Everything from crab spiders here to this bee assassin right here. It's eating a bee. I actually have seen this guy take on a caterpillar of a monarch. Here's a praying mantis that took down a monarch adult. Here's a garden spider that got that, and a snout at the same time, by the way. And then a green lynx spider. I've seen them eating monarch adults as well. So again, you're going to have predators when you have prey, and that's just a fact of life. So remember that planting milkweeds, even if it's only a few, actually does help. These are pictures from about 5 plants that were planted in a beautiful garden. My wife, Terry Lashley, who's a Texas Master Naturalist, is one of the volunteers that helped put in this demonstration native garden at the Visitor Center in Bernie. And there were about 5 plants. And we went out there one fall. It was in August, which is really unusual. And we found just caterpillars everywhere. Look at all these caterpillars. And they were devouring the plants. But what's really great, 2 months from then or a month and a half from then, the milkweeds had put on new leaves and they'd come back just fine. Again, planting a few is better than doing nothing. Although I will say, in Texas, Milkweeds are not the problem that they are in Iowa, my home state, or Illinois or Missouri, where there's all kinds of elimination of milkweeds. And of course, Iowa historically has been the biggest home range breeding territory for monarch butterflies because it had so much common milkweed. And we could go on and on about that, but I'm not going to because it's a little depressing. Anyway, so let's talk about spring. So the butterflies coming back in spring. This is what they look like. This is an extreme example. I actually watched this one die. He was just barely hanging on. He was still nectaring. And then he just stopped moving and went to sleep forever. But when they come back, they're kind of scratched up and clawed up, and they have different wounds on them. But it's amazing. Again, some of these are not only making 1,000 or a 2,000 mile flight south, then they got to come the hundreds of miles back to Texas to breed. So, and they're living anywhere from 7 to 9 months, that last generation. Amazing that these tiny little things that weigh a paperclip are able to pull this off. Well, let's look at what they're looking for when they get back here. We already talked about the milkweed. They're really looking for the milkweed. The females are, of course, and they're mating on their way. And the females may travel, I don't know, several hundred miles laying eggs as they travel from Mexico all the way into potentially Arkansas, Oklahoma, Louisiana. One of the plants that blooms in spring, and I believe it's in your area, is Mexican plum. It's a beautiful tree. It blooms very early. And I wanted to show you, and the reason I want to promote this tree is that when it blooms, boom, everybody goes to it. This was really, really important after the big ice storm or snowstorm a couple of years ago. For whatever reason, all of the buds of this tree, all the flower buds were not killed. They weren't developed enough, so they survived the freezing temperatures, whereas agarita, which is a real common shrub here, was just starting to bloom, and they produced no fruit 2 years ago when that storm hit. But look at, you can just see, including monarch butterflies, this tree, when it's blooming, attracts a ton of springtime activity, all important for these early season insects. And I know you don't have Texas persimmon there in Houston, I don't believe, based on the range maps I've seen, but just to show you, they're looking for all kinds of flowers. And I want to really emphasize that. It's not just about milkweeds in the spring, it's about anything that's blooming, and they really need it all. And this little tiny, look how small that flower is. That's the flower of a Texas persimmon. And yet I turned around one day and here a monarch lands on it and starts nectaring in that itty bitty flower. So they're going to take advantage of anything they can find as a food source to spur them on. And so think about things like crow poison. Grows in people's yards. It's kind of a weedy plant. I think it's a beautiful plant, but it grows in people's yards. It grows in waste areas. This can be an important plant for all kinds of pollinators, including monarchs. 10-petal anemone, same thing. Doesn't look like much, and it grows everywhere, or at least a lot of places. But again, if we just mow these down, we're taking away plants that these monarchs and other early season pollinators need. You're not going to go to a store and find this, but if you get a chance to collect the seeds of that, do so. If you see it in your yard, let it bloom, let it prosper. Enjoy it and let the insects take advantage of it. Another one that starts blooming before the monarchs leave Texas and all the way through the summer, and when they come back into the fall, is frog fruit. There are multiple species of it. Low growing, perennial, tough plant. Gets droughty and it just dies off, but then it comes right back when you get rain. These tiny flowers are super beneficial for lots of pollinators, including monarch butterflies in the fall. Again, very tiny flowers, member of the verbena family by Verbeniaceae, but very, very valuable plant. Also a host plant for the Phaeon crescent, small, beautiful butterfly. And then other things that you'll see, and I didn't know this, except I was out observing. I was down in a wooded area along Honey Creek State Natural Area, along the creek, and this plant, false Bromwell, was blooming. I love the flower. I think it's great. I've got it growing in my garden. But it has these little green flowers that hang down. You wouldn't think they're that valuable, and yet I was seeing hummingbirds, bumblebees, and monarch butterflies foraging on the flowers of this plant right here, all over the place in the springtime. So again, sometimes the things we don't give much attention to get a lot of attention by the insects and the other pollinators that are out there. Then we could talk about some other things that you might be more familiar with. Of course, purple coneflower, very common in the plant trade, very important to a lot of pollinators. They love it, including monarch butterflies. However, its native range in Texas is limited to only a few counties, so it's really not that common. It's very common farther north you go into the tallgrass prairie, but it is used very, very commonly. You guys have a very beautiful, I think it's called sanguine coneflower maybe. Really beautiful looking flower. I think it comes down into your area. I know it's up in the piney woods. They're wonderful flowers for monarchs. The timing of their blooming may be that they start blooming really closer to the end of the time that the monarchs are here in the spring, and then they bloom through the summer, but they may hang on to the fall and monarchs may pick them up then. Then we have giant blue or pitcher sage, Salvia azurea, beautiful plant, very tall. In the hill country, we have a similar species, mealy blue sage, that grows all over the place, blooms multiple times. Monarchs love both of them. This one certainly will bloom when the monarchs are around. And then another plant, and there you guys have your own thistle plants down there, some native, some not. But generally thistle plants are really attractive to large butterflies like swallowtails and monarch butterflies. The top one here is a non-native bull thistle or musk thistle. This one is our Texas thistle, which is native, smaller flower, smaller plant, but beautiful and very attractive to monarchs of all kinds and other butterflies. So then we talk about the fall real quickly here. The fall, you got to have nectar sources. And by the way, when the monarch shows up in the fall, they should look more like this, very crisp, very clean, no scratches, no bent wings, no problems. Should look very, very healthy. So here's what happens in Texas. The monarchs start migrating. Some of them start migrating from Canada in August. It can take up to 2 months to get to Mexico from that far away. As they move south, here's July right here. In August, you're going to notice that the amount of mass of fat they put on, it's not a lot, it's milligrams, but they actually add fat. Uh-oh, I just went dark, didn't I? My light burned out. Never had that happen. September, October, November, as they're coming through Texas, they're adding fat to the mix, okay? It looks kind of ghostly. Well, it is October. Anyway, and so then they live off that fat when they get to Mexico and they're in those big roosts. So that's why flowering plants in the fall are so, so important to our migrating monarchs. So and somebody talked about rattlesnake master earlier. This is a plant that can bloom at the time when the monarchs are moving through. Sometimes, well, it's usually in the late summer. If you're farther north, the monarchs definitely use it. But I wanted to include it because I think it's a great plant. Eryngium yuccifolium. Beautiful plant, member of the parsley family, not the composite family, but that sometimes can be used by monarchs. And then, of course, some monarchs will use snow on the mountain. In our neck of the woods, out here in the hill country, and in your neck of the woods, they may feed on snow on the prairie. Snow on the prairie typically has longer leaves, and these are more oval and very common. Can create some problems for some people. It can cause an itch, and some beekeepers don't like it because it can turn the honey a little bit bitter. There's blue mist flower. This is our native blue mist flower. Has intact leaves, really beautiful. Grows in wetter areas, will grow in shade, will grow in sun. Beautiful plant that both queens and monarchs like. And then we have different kinds of blazing stars. You all have the big Pycnostekia. I'm butchering the name, sorry. Beautiful, beautiful gay feather or blazing star. And then we have tall thoroughwort or late boneset. It actually goes by a gazillion different names. Beautiful flowers. Again, it can be blooming. It's kind of starting to wrap up, but it can be attractive to monarchs that are coming through. Same thing with goldenrods. Goldenrods are peaking right now in much of the state and attract a lot of attention. By the way, goldenrods, their pollen doesn't float through the air, so they do not cause hay fever. And then another one that's starting to bloom right now is Maximilian sunflower. Very tall, robust plant all over many parts of Texas. Very popular among monarchs on the move. And then a plant that has more of a West Texas distribution, but is used in the garden market all over the place is Greg's Blue Mist. It has divided, more toothed leaves, very popular for monarchs and queens especially. And then I'll close this one, Cowpendasia. I'd be curious to know if you've seen it in Harris County. It's around you. It's very common throughout most of the rest of the state and much farther to the north. But Cowpendasia is one of the common annuals that grows out here. And the monarchs go crazy on this plant. We had 1 2-day period a few years ago at Guadalupe River State Park. We banded over 100 monarchs just off a very small patch of these flowers. So really, really valuable to migrating monarchs throughout much of the state. And then somebody earlier mentioned frostweed. And of course, frostweed during a drought can look awful, but when it blooms, it becomes a super, super important plant for migrating monarchs. In fact, a lot of times you'll find small roosts of monarchs in wooded areas where the frostweed is growing and blooming underneath those big oak trees. It's not uncommon. I've seen that in multiple areas around the hill country. And of course, it gets the name frostweed because of this. The water in the stems, when it gets below 32, kind of has a super freezing effect. It bursts the stem. You get all of these really beautiful bits of ice. Looks like Jack Frost was busy. It doesn't last very long until the sun comes out and it warms up above 32. And then one time I was down here and I noticed somewhere down in here, there it is right there. There's this little red dot. And I thought, well, wow, I wonder if a bird dropped some blood or something. And when I looked really closely, I found there was a guy actually climbing the ice. That was pretty weird. So anyway, I had to throw a little humor in there. Hopefully you're all laughing. And I want to close with a couple of thoughts. Educate, educate, educate. Monarch butterflies, most everybody knows what a monarch butterfly is. So as members of NIPSOT, and whether you're a NIPSOT or you're a master naturalist or you're both, get out and educate the public to this beautiful, beautiful, iconic butterfly and what they can do to help. There's all kinds of online resources, some of them on the Clear Lake webpage, really well done webpage, by the way. There's the Houston chapter's got great stuff. There's all kinds of places out here. Journey North, Monarch Watch, Monarch Joint Venture, all of those are really great clearinghouses for monarch and milkweed information. Great books of all kinds, some easier to read, like Robert Pyle's classic book, Sue Halpern. Sarah Dykman just wrote a book and published it on bicycling with butterflies. Great read. I've read all of these. And then the more technical books up here at the top. But lots of information out there. And then there's even a publication that we put together. I got to help put together a little tiny bit of me that is out there that is for teaching about monarch butterflies to children and adults. And then the last thing I'll say is be like Kathy Downs. I want to give a shout out to this lady. She's a master naturalist. She's retired for the most part, although I don't think she'll ever really retire. But she has taught more people in the state of Texas about monarchs and milkweeds than anyone I know, literally anyone I know. And she's a magnificent woman. And I think I want to be Kathy Downs when I grow up. She's just amazing what she has done for the state of Texas and for monarch conservation. And also, lastly, two last real quick things. These are photographs I just received from a lady, Christina, and she took these of springtime roosts down along the Gulf Coast of monarch butterflies as they were coming back north. And the BBC, the British Broadcasting Company, reached out to Texas Parks and Wildlife and then me about finding good activity places that are reliable for spring, not fall, but spring monarch activity, egg laying, raising young, that sort of thing. So if you know of any places, my email is at the end of this, please reach out to me because I'd like to report back to them. And of course, right now the pollinator bio blitz is going on. It goes on for 3 weeks, all the way to the 23rd of October. There is a iNaturalist project. As of about an hour ago, it had 14,000 observations of pollinators and flowers already. So pretty impressive. Lots of involvement from across the state of Texas. All right. I want to thank you for listening and hopefully you got something out of that.
Craig, we had some comments and I think you really put a lot of information out there. My understanding was that the birds didn't really eat the caterpillars, but some people have observed that birds do eat caterpillars.
Well, so there's a couple of things. So first of all, keep in mind that a female monarch might lay somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 eggs in her lifetime of 3 or 4 or 5 weeks. Most of those eggs never hatch. And then when the caterpillars hatch, there are spiders and all kinds of other insects that are eating them. Ants are eating them. Fire ants are terrible with them. So lots of things are wiping them out. There are some milkweeds that don't have a lot of the toxin in it. So it's possible that that could happen. But around here, there are 2 species in Mexico that feast on monarchs that have learned to work around them. And maybe there are a few birds around here that occasionally will eat them, but I'll guarantee you, based on the research, they won't eat many of them. So, but that's very, very interesting to know. And I saw that note about somebody thinking that cardinals had eaten some. That's really, really interesting.
We have the western migration and the eastern migration. And what is the paths of those two?
So the eastern migration goes anywhere from basically just east of the Rocky Mountains, all the way to the coast, the east coast, and then up into Canada. And so when they migrate south, they're generally going in a southwesterly direction. And so they're going to come down. Some that are in Florida stay there year round. They're a year-round population. But the vast majority of them come kind of southwest, and most of them funnel down through Texas and then go to the mountains in north of Mexico City. The western population starts up in the mountains in California and maybe a little bit farther north, and they funnel down to the West Coast, and the vast majority of them stay there. But there is some evidence through tagging that a few of those might actually go and kind of veer to the east, southeast, and join up with the monarchs in Mexico. But by and large, they're two separate populations, same species, separate populations, but again, with some occasional overlap.
One of the other questions was about milkweed vines.
There are a lot of milkweed vines that the monarchs use. Yeah, no, they'll use milkweed vines all the time. Different species of milkweed vines. I've seen that quite often.
Bottom line, what do you want people to do in terms of educating? What is the most important concept?
I think, I'll be honest with you, especially in your part of the state, is to educate people on tropical milkweed and discourage. It's one of those things that you're not going to get people to all stop doing it. I mean, good Lord, arboretums are planting it. But I would continue to educate people about the potential perils of that plant. And and I'm not saying get rid of it completely. I'm saying when it comes to September, late September, just cut them down. Encourage people, whether it's at a botanical garden or wherever it is, to cut those down and let the monarchs pass through. The other thing that when you're educating, the monarch is kind of a bellwether, if you will, and it's also such an iconic butterfly. Everybody knows what it is. So the monarch butterfly can be used, and I hate that word. It sounds bad. It sounds like it has a negative connotation, but it can be used as a kind of the leader of conservation for pollinators and the use of native plants. It's out there for everybody to say, hey, do you like them? Do you know what a monarch is? Hey, here's what you can do to help. And I know a lot of people want to plant milkweeds. I know that they're tough to grow. They just are. The good news about milkweeds in Texas is there are plenty of milkweeds. And I know some people will disagree with me, but at least in the hill country, there are so many milkweeds that never get touched by monarch butterflies. There are plenty of milkweeds of certain species. So the biggest thing is, I think, is if they want to try some milkweeds, please do. It doesn't hurt, but also native plants, native flowering plants, encourage people through your plant sales. But just awareness, just keep building awareness for native plants, for how they benefit our native pollinators, how our native pollinators then benefit us. Because, hey, let's face it, if the pollinators slack off, we start losing them like they're losing them in other parts of the world, and all of a sudden our grocery stores in those produce sections are going to look a whole lot more empty. And I'm not convinced that technology is going to save us from that. So it's just that we need to treat all of this holistically, that we're part of nature. We are not a part from nature. And I think that's the best thing that you can do. And I know the work that you all do is positive, and just keep that up. Keep that up. We all need to be out there preaching the good word for nature, I guess I would say.
Thank you, Craig. I want to remind everybody the combination of Craig's talk plus Chris from last month, I think will answer a lot of the questions on tropical milkweed. She really hit it hard.
Yeah, I know she does. She
doesn't tell you to cut it back. She tells you to pull it out.
I know. I'm a little more loosey goosey. I'm more like Charlie Brown. A little, Chris doesn't mess around.
The combination of those two talks, I think, will get everybody pretty up to speed on what's going on with the monarch and the types of plants they need. So, Craig, I really want to thank you a lot.
You bet. Good to talk with you all. Y'all take care and enjoy this beautiful fall. It sounds like maybe it's going to start cooling off for real soon. So let's hope.
Okay. Thank you.
Speaking as a northerner. Take care. Bye.